I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. And I guess here we can extend to the rest of the United States and the world, because today we're talking about a 2-year study of the role brain activity patterns play in people who stutter. That's currently underway at the University of Texas, San Antonio. And I'm joined now by Express News health reporter Lauren Caruba for details on the research. So, Lauren, great to have you back here on the program. I believe your title at the Express News has changed since we last spoke. Let's, as I just mentioned, start with the basics. This speech issue that UTSA is trying to solve. While I was reading your article, I myself was surprised to learn that this speech disorder affects about 3 million people in the U.S. alone, much more than I would have expected. And there's even quite a lot of range in how it can affect people. Tell me about it.
That's right. So stuttering affects about 3 million people, like you said, in the United States, and it can kind of manifest in different ways. Basically, what happens is that a person will develop what's called disfluencies in their speech, and there's a couple different ways that can happen. Some people who go through a severe period with stuttering might have what's called like a block, and they have difficulty producing words at all. And then there's a couple of different ways that it can affect things like pronunciation. And so if someone is repeating like the first part of a word multiple times is one example, or if they are drawing out a part of the word as they're trying to pronounce it. And so the interesting thing about stuttering, though, is that people who stutter aren't necessarily stuttering on every single word that they're saying. It's more something that crops up in their speech. And so they will kind of flip-flop back and forth between what's called fluent speech and disfluent speech. And so that's the interesting thing, is that it's not necessarily affecting every single word that they're saying, but it is something that affects their speech overall.
So, Lauren, this ongoing 2-year study of the role brain activity patterns play in people who stutter in many different ways, as you just explained, it's funded by a $380,000 grant from the National Institutes of Health. So who's heading all this up for UTSA? And is this something that's been studied there in the past, or is this something new that they're using with this grant money?
So the study is being looked at in UTSA's Department of Psychology. The principal investigator is a psychology professor at UTSA, and a researcher from Texas State University is also partnering on the research. And Edward Golub, who's the principal investigator on the grant, is heading it up, and he has studied stuttering for quite some years. And the way he explained it to me is that this is kind of building on what they had been looking at already. I think they had published some papers previously, kind of looking at what happens in the brain for people who are stuttering versus not stuttering. And I think that previous work had kind of shown that there's like a correlation between the electrical activity in the brain when someone is stuttering versus not stuttering. Because if you kind of look at a person who stutters, like if you look at their brain, you're not seeing, there's nothing like very different about their brain versus a person who does not stutter. And so they showed that there was like this association between stuttering and what is happening in the brain, the electrical activity in the brain. And so what they're trying to do now is look at this on the individual level. And so they are having participants who stutter come to their lab multiple times. They're coming back and they're kind of spending hours doing these speech activities where they're wearing an EEG cap that is covered in electrodes, and it's measuring the electrical activity from their brain that's emitted from their scalp. And so they are doing these exercises that are designed to elicit their stuttering. So and over time, as they gather this data on their brain activity, they're hoping to kind of build models of each individual person's brain activity when they're speaking fluently versus disfluently, when they're stuttering and not stuttering, to kind of to try to better understand what's happening in their brain when they're stuttering and when they are speaking normally.
And so along with your article at expressnews.com, there's a video of someone who participated, as you just mentioned, in this research. Tell me about this young man and how he helped.
So Jack Rodriguez is 19 and he's a sophomore at Texas State. I got to spend some time watching him as he participated in the study at the UTSA lab recently. And he had attended a speech clinic with one of the professors who's working on this study, Farzan Irani. He's at Texas State. And he runs like this summer speech clinic where people who stutter can kind of come and work on the disorder. And so he has kind of always been interested in the underlying science behind stuttering. He's stuttered his entire life, and his father also stutters. And about 2 years ago, he went through this really severe period with his stuttering where he had what I mentioned earlier about like the block. Like he was just really having trouble producing words at all. And whereas most of the time he would stutter, but it wouldn't kind of take over all of his speech in the way that it did. So he had a couple of weeks where it was just really severe. And so that period, he kind of called it his rock bottom period with the disorder. And so he has always been interested in the science behind it. And so after attending that speech clinic with one of the professors who's working on this, he decided to participate in the study. And so, what he was doing is he sat in this large soundproof booth in the lab, and he has the EEG cap on his head. He's sitting in this chair facing a screen, and essentially what's happening is the screen is kind of flashing these what they call pseudo words at him, which are basically these pairs of made up words that are very difficult to say, even if you don't have a speech disorder. They're just kind of nonsense words, and he has to say them. And over time, this is like each session is about like 2 hours or so. He's like doing all these like different repetitions of these different randomly paired pseudo words. And at the same time, the computer is like measuring his brain activity while he's doing this in real time.
Dardo Wedhorn. Jimp Tunji. Rusus Hawitat.
And so that's the experience of one person who participated in this research. Were there other ways that other participants gathered data, or was it all similar to what you just described?
Yeah, so basically, I think each participant is going through the same exercise. And so the idea is that they are having each of the participants come back and do the same exercises over and over again. And so they're gathering a bunch of data on individual people's stuttering patterns and the brain activity related to those patterns. And so the day I was there, he was there for about probably 2 hours, but he will come back several times so that they can gather data on him specifically. They need, basically, the reason why they're trying to elicit the stuttering is they need enough data to kind of be able to build a computational model of what's going on with his brain specifically when he's stuttering and when he's not stuttering. And so they're doing the same thing for each of the participants.
And so, of course, like a lot of things in the medical industry, eventually you're looking for a cure, but there's a lot of steps on that road to finding a cure. This is no different. And that being the case, what's the specific aim of this research? What are they trying to do specifically with the data that they're gathering?
Definitely. So I would not characterize what they're trying to do here as like finding a quote unquote cure. I think there are things that people who stutter can do to help them work on the condition, but it's not something that has a strict cure, and it can actually be pretty resistant to improvement. But what the idea behind this is that, if the idea goes back to the kind of flip-flopping nature of stuttering, that sometimes a person who stutters, their brain is, working just fine, and then all of a sudden it will flip to the disfluent state. And so what they're trying to do is to try to be able to predict when a person may or may not stutter. And so the idea is that, they're going to try to work with the person's brain and what state it's in. And so they're not trying to cure the disease, but they're trying to, if a person can sometimes be in a state where they're not stuttering, and they have an understanding of why and when that happens, then the idea is that they're going to try to keep that person in that more optimal brain state. And so the investigator on the grant, Ed Golub, the way he explained it to me was, what is the person's brain doing when the person is fluent, and what is it doing when it's disfluent? And if they can distinguish between those two different states, it's kind of like the person's brain at one point is bringing its A game versus its C game. And so the idea is that using this data on their brain activity, they can try to help the person train their brain to stay in the state where they're bringing their A game more often than when they're bringing their C game, which would be stuttering.
So that all being the goal of this 2-year study, what's next for the team at UTSA and everyone else involved with this specific research?
I think they're still very much in the middle of the research, and they actually I think are still soliciting participants. I think they have 9 or 10 at the moment, and I think as many participants that they can get would be better, because then they'll have more data. And so they're looking for people between the ages of 18 and 100 who stutter for the study. They're looking for individuals who stutter, but not who has suffered from any like major neurological or psychiatric disorders, or who have had head injuries. I think they're looking for people with developmental stuttering, and so they're still looking for more people. And I think that they're still in like kind of the initial phase of the study, but they're doing some really interesting work over there.
And then, Lauren, before we say goodbye, a few moments left. Any final thoughts on anything that we haven't covered so far?
I think it's a really interesting way to think about the condition, and they're using technology that we've had for a very long time. This EEG technology has been around for a long time, but the difference is that they are using highly advanced computers to essentially measure the brain activity in real time down to the millisecond, and to analyze these signals in a way that we couldn't previously understand them. And so they're kind of using a combination of old technology with the new technology to try to look at something that, is very rare, but still does affect a lot of people collectively. And so it's definitely a really interesting work.
And thanks to San Antonio Express News health reporter Lauren Caruba for joining me for the second time here on today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorlin.